Welcome, everybody. My name is Eric Christensen from Mount Royal University Library, and I'm going to be presenting this four-part video series titled The Research Process, Finding a Research Gap and Developing a PICO Question. So there's three broad objectives for this video series. By the end of this lecture, you'll be able to explain three things. First is the difference between information seeking and knowledge contribution. You'll be able to explain the research process, so the steps required to work through a research project and develop one, as well as the research gap. In terms of the outline for this lecture series, there are 7 things that are going to be covered. Not all of them are going to be covered in video 1, but I'll guide you from one video to the next. Step 1 is that we're going to talk about the difference between information seeking and knowledge creation, which is actually a pretty foundational concept. 2, we're going to talk about the definition of a research gap and why it's so important to demonstrate one before you undertake a new research project. Third, I'm going to talk about the research process in general and all of the steps associated. Fourth, I'm going to use an example topic, and I'm going to use that topic to develop a search process to find academic sources. Fifth, I'm going to be identifying a possible research gap based on the research that I found from my search process. Sixth, I'm going to be developing a PICO question based on the research gap that I've identified. And seventh, we're going to review the concepts and steps from this 3-part series. So the first thing I want to discuss is the difference between information seeking and knowledge contribution. Typically, information seeking is anything that we do to answer a question or solve a problem. So we look for existing information to answer some unknown in our life. Knowledge contribution is actually quite different. In this scenario, what we do is we look at the existing landscape of information on a given topic, and we try to find a question that hasn't been sufficiently answered by the existing information. So what we do is we try to find a research gap, and then we focus our research project around that gap, and that becomes a new or novel contribution to the body of knowledge. One way to think about knowledge contribution is to think about a brick wall. And every single brick in that wall represents a study or a contribution to the body of knowledge on the topic that we're looking at. So an original study is really one brick. It's just a piece of the puzzle that we contribute to a larger body of knowledge. So in this case, I have an image here of a brick wall. There's all sorts of bricks filled in, but there's a slot missing. And that missing slot could represent a question that hasn't been answered yet. And that's our research gap. So we want to find out what it is that hasn't been answered so we can figure out what new we contribute to the field. And then we design a study and we deliberately fill that gap. Identifying a research gap. So how do we do this? Well, the first step is that we go through and we analyze the existing literature. We want to get a feel for what has been published previously so we can start to hone in on something that's new. So the second is that we identify an aspect of our topic that the literature does not sufficiently address. So we're not super happy with the answers that have been provided. And both 1 and 2, those 2 conditions ideally should be met before you go and develop a PICO or any kind of research question and you undertake a novel study. Now, if we zoom out and think about the research process from a distance, identifying a research gap makes a bit more sense. So the first thing is that we develop a topic of interest. So not a question, but a topic or area that we're interested in. We don't have a question at this point. We break that topic down into keywords, searchable items, and then we do some literature searching. And when I talk about literature searching, I'm speaking quite broadly. That could be looking at Wikipedia to start, or an online encyclopedia to get a definition, or to looking at some general websites or information. It would also include doing some searches once you have some keywords to work with in an academic database to find the scholarly literature. Ultimately, we want to get a good body of scholarly literature from our lit search to understand what's been done. Step 3 is that we identify a research gap based on what has not been addressed so far in the existing literature. Once we've identified that research gap, then we develop a draft PICO question. And I say draft because It's noted in step 5 that you're going to have to refine that question and then design a study method to go with it. So 4 and 5 are inherently linked, but we want to draft a question once we've identified a research gap. And then in step 5, we probably want to refine that question. It'll take several revisions, and then we can start thinking about how we're going to go about answering it. And that would be the method that we use.